What data viz is best? Which one should you choose? I'm sure you've sat through plenty of presentations, you've created them yourself perhaps, and you've gone, yeah, that chart just isn't really very easy to understand. Maybe you've had to think across 50 bars, or there's been 10 different colors in the chart, and it's been really kind of hard to process, or people in the meeting have looked at it and they've said, hang on, I just need a minute to work out what this chart's telling me. Going to give you a couple of tips for, I guess, helping you think about what type of chart do you choose, because you've got loads of options. You don't have to just click on the recommended chart from Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets. You can certainly, and you should be really discerning and deliberate about which one you choose, and have a reason why. So the first one is a line graph is usually really good for data that's happening across time. So it's a longitudinal representation. Usually always for a line graph, time is on the x-axis. So if you're not operating with time, a line chart's not for you. With time and with a longitudinal kind of time series chart, one of the things I guess that's important to think about is how do you provide the context for whether it's a target that you were trying to achieve over time, so putting in a target line, putting in the context maybe of a competitor or what the market's doing, so do a point of comparison. Because while a line graph or chart is really useful to tell a picture over time, without a context line or second measure, it doesn't actually tell people whether it's high or low, for example. So make sure you do that as a little bit of a point of comparison. The second one is a bar chart, and the bar charts are really useful when you have categories. So it might be categories of something you've been selling. It could be different stores or different kind of states or territories that you're working in, and you can have a bar chart that represents the change across them. If you've got 50 bars though, a bar chart is not for you, because what you should be doing is thinking about better ways of maybe aggregating the data, because otherwise people are not going to be able to make sense of it because there's too much information. So, the benefit of good visualizations is that it's meant to drop the cognitive load of what's happening in our brains while we're trying to process the data. So if you're overcomplicating it with 50 bars or even more than that and lots of colors, you're actually not helping your audience. It's not actually useful. So in bar charts, think about potentially if you do have a lot of categories along the bottom, think about the way that you could maybe highlight the top 5 or the most important and maybe group the others. If you have a lot of small values, group them into an other category so that you don't end up with a whole stack of bars that are actually not particularly useful and not going to help with the analysis. The next type is a box and whisker plot, and a box and whisker plot is used less frequently, I guess, in my work, and I see it less frequently, but it's a really good way of representing the spread in the data. So if what you're showing is not categories, it's not an average or a median over time, but you actually want to be able to highlight the gap between the high, the low, the median in the middle, and be able to show the quartiles of the data, box and whisker plot every day of the week is the best option. I will say though, if you're not confident with what a box and whisker plot tells you and how to read and interpret it, there's a very good chance your audience is not confident either. So whenever I use box and whisker charts, I always make sure I just go over and explain the max, the min, the median, the quarters of the data, and I just go over a really quick kind of understanding of it just to make sure they are all on the same page, because I don't want to assume that they get it. Box and whisker plot is probably the most explained chart in my world, because for many people, they haven't seen one since they were in school learning maths. But if you want to be able to compare that top to bottom, median, all of that, and across different categories, it is the best by far. You can do really good things like you can sort the data by, for example, the median result. And so you can actually have it stacking down across the chart, which makes it look a little bit better. The other way you can show the change is through a lollipop chart. And this is not as easy to create in Excel or Google Sheets. You would need kind of a Tableau, Google Looker Studio, for example, Power BI. But what it does is it's called a lollipop because it shows a circle at one end and the other end, and then there's a line in between. So it's a great representation of the spread again. So it's useful if the median doesn't matter, the quarters don't matter too much, but it's here's where we started, here's where we ended, and this is how big the change is in between. That can be a really useful way of showcasing the change, as I say, without kind of needing the granularity of where's the center and where does our data actually split into those quarters. Pie charts. Let's talk about them. There is a whole lot of hate on the internet for and in the real world for pie charts. And you know what? I actually don't hate them. They do have an important place in our data storytelling and in our creation of the data into charts. However, there are a couple of kind of key tips that I think you would be best to follow. So again, you don't overwhelm people. You're trying to make their job easier by looking at the visual rather than overcomplicating it. If your pie chart has more than 4 pieces of pie, it's not a pie. It should not be a pie chart. Ditch it. Because it becomes very hard with all the lines to work out, okay, well, if that's on this angle and that's on that angle, like how big's that compared to this? And yes, you can use data labels, but the more pieces you put into the pie, the harder it becomes to do that kind of processing of the information. So 4 max, not 5, not 6, 4. Ideally, if you've got 3 or 4 things, like that's a perfect pie chart. But again, the whole point of a pie chart is to show all of the things that make up the whole. So that's very different to looking at something where you want to see what's happened over time or what's happening in different categories in a bar chart, or what the spread's looking like. We're talking about how do we actually represent what makes up the whole. And this is true for donut charts as well, which is essentially a pie chart, but with the donut hole taken out of the center, and they can look a bit prettier, but they'll do much the same thing, but the same rules apply. So we only want a maximum of 4 things. And the other really key part of, I guess, the creation of a pie chart, and it might sound pedantic, but there's a reason for it. Your first line or piece of a pie needs to be vertical. It needs to start right in the center, and it needs to be perfectly vertical, sitting straight up and down the page. If you think from that, we read right to left. So we then start to read around the pie into the first piece, and that should be the biggest piece. And we're going from big to small. But we need that piece at the top because we're then making judgments about 25%, 30%, maybe less than that. We're making judgments about the size of the pie, and we're complicating it for our audience if that line is not vertical. So don't start like this at the top of your chart with a V. That's not what we want. We want a line that's comes straight through like that. The last one, and it is a data visualization technique, and I hear people all the time say to me, look, this is what I do, but I don't think it's really data viz. 100% it is heat maps. Color coding cells in a table. Highlighting, the values that are high, medium, and low. It is a visualization technique. It is a chart option. It is super useful for helping people identify where those higher, middle, and lower values are. Doesn't matter what colors you use. My standard rule is you just have to be consistent across your organization and your team. So if green is good and high in your world and blue is very high, people need to be seeing the same colors in every visualization that we're giving them. So what that allows us to do is, I guess, break into 2 categories all of the compartments that make up the whole. Look, we can give people whole spreadsheets and that can be useful, but even better still, if we're able to kind of condense the data into smaller categories. Again, there's less processing time, which when we have less processing time, it ideally means that we have more time to think about, well, what's the most important trend and insight that I can see here, and what do I do with that information? And then the final one for today is there are times where you can just show a value. You can just have, and Power BI and Tableau call this a scorecard. There is no harm in having a box with a big value. If you want to talk about your revenue for the year, there is no harm in you having a box with a number in it, which is called a scorecard. The only thing I would say about that is, again, provide some context. Have an up or down arrow comparing that number to your budget or to your target, Have an up or down arrow comparing this year to where you were last year. A number by itself doesn't give a lot of context unless people have got a really good understanding of the metrics. So let's not assume that they do. So always think about how do you provide that context. So I hope it's been really obvious that, there is not one chart that fits every purpose or every purpose that we have to share data. They all have pros and cons. There's ways of creating data visualizations that are better and worse than others. As the data storytellers, and as the people playing in this space, it's on us to think about how do we actually visualize this in a way that makes the trends and insights really obvious, not only for us, but for the people that we want to share the information with.